Introduction. What's a crucial confrontation? And who cares? A profound and unsettling reality defines the modern human experience. We are frequently forced to choose between the terror of speaking up and the torment of remaining silent. Imagine arriving at a sprawling plywood mill nestled in the verdant foothills of northwestern Washington, prepared to study the intricate dynamics of corporate accountability, only to be greeted by the flashing red lights of an ambulance. This was the exact scenario faced by two researchers embarking on a months-long study of workplace behavior. When they cautiously inquired about the medical emergency, the plant manager shamefacedly revealed that a night shift supervisor, a man otherwise regarded as a decent fellow, had resorted to his fists to resolve a dispute with a subordinate over a quality control procedure. Frustrated by a missed expectation, the supervisor had abandoned dialogue for physical violence, leaving an employee in need of stitches. This primal response to disappointment stands in stark contrast to another, equally destructive reaction. Consider the quiet desperation of an experienced head nurse standing paralyzed in a hospital corridor as two physicians debate a course of treatment she knows to be potentially fatal. Decades earlier, her cheerful attempt to correct a mistaken diagnosis was met with such profound disdain from the attending doctors that she learned a bitter, indelible lesson. Authority is never to be questioned. Now, facing a life-or-death moment, her expectations are shattered, yet she opts for the agonizing safety of silence, wondering if the patient will survive her failure to speak. These two extremes, the explosive rage of the mill supervisor and the dangerous reticence of the seasoned nurse, represent the fundamental dilemma of human interaction. When a promise is broken, when an expectation is violated, or when simple common courtesy is abandoned, how do we respond? The daily landscape is littered with such challenges. A subordinate adopts a tone dripping with insubordination. A manager unilaterally imposes an impossible deadline, daring anyone to object. A teenager returns home flaunting a radical, defiant change in appearance. An accountant uncovers blatant financial malpractice by a major client. In every instance, the core issue remains identical. Someone has disappointed us, and we are left grappling with the fallout. These high-stakes interactions are what we define as crucial confrontations. To confront, in this context, does not mean to attack or to badger. Rather, it signifies the act of holding someone accountable, face-to-face, with absolute candor and unyielding respect. When these moments are navigated successfully, the immediate problem is resolved, and the underlying relationship is profoundly strengthened. The path to mastering this delicate art was illuminated not by theoretical abstraction, but by the exhaustive observation of thousands of highly effective individuals. Returning to the plywood mill, the researchers bypassed the aggressive enforcers to study the plant's most respected supervisor, a physically unassuming woman who possessed a remarkable capacity to hold her team accountable without ever raising her voice or a hand. She, along with a select group of exceptional peers, became the foundation of an intensive study spanning 2 decades and encompassing over 25,000 individuals across diverse industries. The undeniable conclusion emerged: the most influential people in any organization are not necessarily the most charismatic or the highest ranking. They are the individuals who can skillfully step into the breach of a broken promise, confront the most volatile issues, and emerge with the problem solved and the relationship enhanced. The consequences of failing to master these confrontations are etched into the headlines of our most tragic national disasters. In the winter of 1982, a commercial airliner plunged into a freezing river because a co-pilot, noticing a dangerous accumulation of ice on the wings, chose to hint at the problem rather than directly confront the captain's decision to take off. Politeness superseded survival. In a similarly horrifying medical lapse, a patient checked into a clinic for a minor earache and awoke to find he had received a vasectomy simply because he had been conditioned never to question the actions of medical authorities. Even the catastrophic loss of space shuttles can be traced back to organizational cultures so deeply repressive that brilliant engineers chose to bury their catastrophic fears about faulty components rather than risk the career suicide of speaking truth to power. Beyond these dramatic tragedies lie the chronic, corrosive failures of everyday life. We suffer under the weight of impossible workloads because we fear the corporate treason of refusing an unreasonable demand. We endure the sudden unilateral rewriting of marital agreements, such as the sudden demand to have children, because the prospect of confronting a spouse's ultimatum feels tantamount to inviting divorce. Behind every organizational malfunction and every fractured family lies a singular unifying root cause. People are staring into the abyss of a broken promise, paralyzed by the fear of engagement. Frightened by the prospect of conflict, they retreat into a tortured silence, hoping the issue will magically resolve itself. Or, terrified that their concerns will be ignored, they erupt into violent, coercive monologues that destroy trust and invite fierce resistance. Escaping this debilitating cycle requires more than new policies or updated systems. Organizations spend millions attempting to engineer better performance through structural changes, only to watch those initiatives wither because employees lack the interpersonal skills to hold one another accountable to the new standards. The Centers for Disease Control can mandate more sinks in a hospital, but until medical professionals find the courage to confront a colleague who fails to wash their hands, infection rates will remain unchanged. Change demands a fundamental shift in human interaction. The stakes for acquiring this skill set are staggering. In manufacturing plants where supervisors learned to effectively confront infractions, not only did the physical violence cease, but the covert sabotage, the quiet grinding of expensive materials into scrap to punish abusive bosses, vanished, leading to massive leaps in profitability and morale. Across telecommunications, healthcare, and defense industries, the correlation between improved confrontation skills and dramatic surges in productivity and quality is undeniable. We are surrounded by a vast reservoir of untapped potential, squandered by a workforce that often gives only the bare minimum required to avoid termination, simply because no one possesses the skill to demand more without causing offense. This exact same dynamic dictates the survival of our most intimate relationships. Exhaustive psychological studies tracking couples over decades have revealed that the ability to navigate difficult conversations with respect and honesty predicts marital success with astonishing accuracy. We are the primary role models for our children, passing down either the tools for healthy resolution or the toxic habits of silence and violence. If we cannot effectively confront the disappointments that inevitably arise in every sphere of existence, we are condemned to endure the chronic erosion of our teams, our institutions, and our families. But by embracing the discipline of honest, respectful accountability, we unlock the profound freedom of never having to walk away from a conflict again. Chapter 1. Choose what and if. How to know what. Crucial confrontation to hold, and if you should hold it. Human interaction rarely presents us with neatly packaged, single-issue dilemmas. The challenges that matter most, the ones that keep us awake at night and erode our peace of mind, arrive in massive, entangled bundles. Imagine the recurring scenario of in-laws who drop by unannounced at dinner time, despite prior agreements to call ahead. Their sudden arrival presents a multitude of interconnected offenses. There is the immediate logistical problem of insufficient food. There is the deeper issue of a repeatedly broken promise and the subsequent loss of trust. And then there is the emotional manipulation that ensues when they pout in the corner after being asked to wait. Which of these threads do we pull? Or consider a professional betrayal? A boss who publicly reneges on a promised raise during a crowded meeting, preventing any immediate pushback. When finally cornered in a hallway, the boss dismisses the grievance by citing their own lack of adequate compensation and accusing the subordinate of being insensitive. Before a single word of confrontation can be uttered, two towering questions demand resolution. What exactly are we confronting, and if we should even speak up at all? Choosing what, selecting the correct issue to address, is arguably the most critical step in navigating complex human problems. When a teenage daughter misses her midnight curfew by an hour, the apparent infraction is her tardiness. Yet, beneath that surface lies a labyrinth of alternative violations. A broken promise, a shattered trust, a terrifying disregard for her own safety, an act of willful rebellion, or perhaps a calculated retaliation for a previous grounding. If a parent chooses to confront the wrong issue from this extensive list, even a perfectly executed conversation will leave the underlying rot untouched. Identifying the right problem is the only way to ensure it does not return. Signs that you're dealing with the wrong problem. Your solution doesn't get you what you really want. The true nature of a problem is often obscured by our initial emotional reactions to it. Consider the chaos that erupts on a school playground when one child hurls a racial slur at another and the second child responds with an insult about weight. When the principal contacts the parents, the mother of the child who used the slur storms into the school, demanding to handle the discipline herself and defiantly announcing she will reward her daughter with a special lunch instead of the school's prescribed isolation. Faced with this aggressive parent, it is easy to become fixated on her rudeness, her blatant interference with school policy, or her terrible parenting strategy. However, attempting to punish the mother or enforce rigid compliance will not achieve the ultimate goal. The true underlying issue is the destruction of a collaborative partnership between the school and the parent, a partnership essential for the child's behavioral development. If the proposed solution, whether it is a disciplinary committee hearing or a rigid enforcement of rules, does not yield the desired result of cooperative problem solving, it is a glaring indicator that the wrong problem is being addressed. You're constantly discussing the same issue. A persistent, echoing grievance is another clear sign of misdirection. Imagine a business owner who repeatedly confronts a receptionist for arriving late. The conversation happens, the behavior improves for a few days, and then the tardiness resumes. The owner summons the courage to speak up each time, but returning to the exact same script is a profound failure of diagnosis. Groundhog Day. When individuals repeat an offense, the nature of the problem fundamentally shifts with each new occurrence. Effective problem solvers do not trap themselves in a recursive loop, fighting the same battle as if it were the first. The initial instance of tardiness is an issue of punctuality. The second instance is a failure to keep a promise. The third is the beginning of a pattern that demands formal disciplinary action. Treating repeated failures as isolated incidents guarantees a lifetime of unresolved frustration. You're getting increasingly upset. If the emotional intensity surrounding a recurring problem continues to escalate, it is a profound signal that the core issue remains untouched. When the business owner finally dissects his escalating anger regarding the tardy receptionist, he realizes the late arrivals are merely the tip of the iceberg. The receptionist is a friend and neighbor, and the true source of his torment is the agonizing feeling that she is exploiting their personal relationship to evade professional accountability. The tardiness is the symptom. The exploitation of friendship is the disease that must be confronted. Confronting the right issue. Extracting the core violation from a tangled mess of emotions and behaviors requires immense patience and precise emotional surgery. We are often propelled by the adrenaline of the moment, rushing to address the most visible or convenient target rather than the most crucial one. A parent pacing the floor at 1:00 a.m. may be hyper-focused on the clock, failing to realize that their true anger stems from the child's profound lack of basic courtesy, the failure to simply call and alleviate their terrifying worry. To avoid fighting the wrong battles, an infraction must be distilled to its absolute essence. If the core grievance cannot be articulated in a single lucid sentence before the conversation begins, the ensuing dialogue will inevitably degenerate into a chaotic, unfocused argument. Helpful tools to get to the right confrontation. Think CPR. When trapped in a cycle of recurring problems, the CPR framework, content pattern relationship, serves as an indispensable diagnostic tool. The first time an offense occurs, the discussion must center on content, the immediate observable behavior. It is the specific event that just transpired. When the behavior repeats, the conversation must elevate to the pattern. The issue is no longer just the isolated event, but the historical sequence of failed agreements. A pattern acknowledges that history matters, and that repeated infractions inherently damage predictability and trust. When the pattern persists unchecked, the focus must shift entirely to the relationship. The core concern is no longer the missed deadline or the repeated tardiness. It is the corrosive impact these failures are having on mutual respect and collaborative trust. The discussion must address the strain of constant policing and the creeping realization that the other person's word is meaningless. Unbundling consequences. To further dissect a complex problem, one must look beyond the offending behavior itself and examine the shockwaves it creates. The true issue often resides in the consequences. When a subordinate delivers a critical report 3 hours late, the tardiness is merely the catalyst. The profound problem is the potential loss of a major client, the agonizing realization that the employee cannot be trusted with critical path assignments, or the draining necessity of implementing suffocating micromanagement. By asking what consequences the behavior inflicts on the task, the relationship, and other stakeholders, the true priority of the confrontation becomes unmistakably clear. Intentions. Equally important to what happens after an action is what occurred before it, the unseen motives that drove the behavior. When a colleague eagerly agrees to format a report and then bypasses you to hand it directly to the boss, the missing report is a minor issue compared to the perceived intent. The conclusion that the colleague is actively attempting to steal credit and sabotage your standing is the true source of the conflict. We constantly draw conclusions about the invisible motives of others, and when those perceived motives are selfish or malicious, the intention itself becomes the mandatory subject of the confrontation. Prioritizing. Ask what you do and don't want. As the dissection of a problem reveals an ever-expanding list of consequences, patterns, and perceived intentions, the sheer volume of potential issues can be paralyzing. The ultimate clarifying mechanism is to ask 3 precise questions. What do I really want for myself? What do I really want for the other person? What do I really want for the relationship? An application. Consider the scenario of neighbors picking up your children for a movie in the back of an open pickup truck, a blatant violation of your strict family safety rules. When you express concern, the neighbor mocks you, and your spouse immediately undermines your authority by laughing off the risk. The truck rumbles away. What is the true issue to confront with your spouse? You could address the immediate safety danger, but the children are already gone. You could address the pattern of your spouse yielding to social pressure. You could address the perceived intent that looking cool matters more than child safety. But by asking what you truly want and don't want, the absolute core of the crisis emerges. You want to present a unified front. You don't want to be publicly marginalized. The singular, critical problem to confront is the pattern of your spouse unilaterally making critical family decisions that deviate from core values without securing mutual agreement. Decide if identifying the correct problem does not automatically mandate that a confrontation must occur. The decision to speak up is a distinct and agonizing choice, fraught with potential peril. While some violations demand immediate attention, others present a terrifying calculus. Will speaking up resolve the issue, or will it ignite a catastrophic battle, destroy a relationship, or end a career? When it's clearly a broken promise. In environments governed by explicit metrics, quality scorecards, budget variances, clear performance indicators, the mandate to speak up is unambiguous. The same clarity applies to blatant domestic broken promises. When the divergence between the expected and the observed is undeniable, the confrontation is a straightforward necessity. When it's unclear and iffy, the true agony lies in the gray areas. The infractions are ambiguous, the power dynamics are intimidating, and the consequences of initiating a dialogue feel akin to walking through a minefield. To navigate this perilous terrain, one must learn to identify the psychological traps that drive us toward unnecessary silence or reckless aggression. Not speaking when you should. The most common failure in crucial confrontations is not speaking poorly, but not speaking at all. We retreat into the shadows, hoping the rot will somehow heal itself. To diagnose an unwarranted retreat into silence, 4 harsh questions must be confronted. Am I acting out my concerns? When we choose silence over confrontation, we rarely achieve genuine peace. The unspoken anger ferments, eventually leaking out through our pores in toxic, passive-aggressive behaviors. We convince ourselves we are being tolerant, but our non-verbal hostility, the sarcastic jabs, the heavy sighs, the pointed humor, the icy withdrawals, betrays us. We cannot hide our authentic emotions. If we refuse to talk the problem out, we are condemned to act it out, invariably escalating the damage. What are we thinking? Setting aside a festering problem in the vague hope that time will cure it is a profound delusion. Unaddressed resentment does not dissipate. It metastasizes. Is my conscience nagging me? Often we remain silent because we feel isolated in our concern. We observe a dangerous medical lapse, a financial ethical breach, or a reckless safety violation, but peer pressure and the intimidating aura of authority force us to swallow our objections. Yet, a quiet, persistent internal voice continues to agitate. This nagging conscience is the ultimate indicator that our silence is a capitulation, not a reasoned choice. Am I choosing the certainty of silence over the risk of speaking up? Our greatest psychological deception is substituting the question, should I speak up, with, can I succeed? When we envision a horrific, catastrophic failure, we instantly embrace the miserable certainty of the status quo rather than risking the unknown. We construct elaborate, catastrophic narratives to justify our cowardice, utilizing two primary cognitive distortions: downplaying the cost of not speaking. We minimize the agonizing reality of our current suffering. We fixate solely on the immediate pain rather than acknowledging the long-term systemic damage of allowing the behavior to continue. We adapt to the misery, convincing ourselves that working for an abusive boss or enduring a toxic relationship is simply the natural order of the universe. We become numb to our own degradation, exaggerating the cost of expressing our views. Simultaneously, we inflate the potential risks of confrontation to apocalyptic proportions. We chain together highly improbable worst-case scenarios. Confronting the boss will inevitably lead to getting fired, which will lead to divorce, which will lead to destitution. We elevate remote possibilities to absolute certainties, paralyzing ourselves with phantom terrors. We falsely believe that the world universally punishes honesty, ignoring the reality that skilled communicators navigate treacherous power dynamics every single day without suffering ruin. Am I telling myself that I'm helpless? The final refuge of the chronically silent is the declaration of absolute helplessness. We convince ourselves that the other person is an unyielding monster, entirely immune to reason. In truth, our paralysis often stems not from their immutability, but from our own lack of skill. We are terrified because we know our default method of confrontation involves subtle attacks and emotional outbursts, guaranteeing a disastrous outcome. If our silence is born from a lack of conversational competence, the solution is not permanent surrender, but the deliberate acquisition of influence skills. Responding to the signs. When the physical symptoms of suppressed anger manifest, when the conscience refuses to quiet, when the mental gymnastics of minimizing pain and exaggerating catastrophe become exhausting, and when the illusion of helplessness is shattered, the mandate is clear. The silence is unwarranted. The confrontation must happen. Speaking up. When you shouldn't, conversely, there are moments when initiating a confrontation is a profound tactical error. Some expectations are fluid, some promises are tacitly understood to be flexible, and organizational cultures often possess unwritten histories regarding which infractions are punished and which are ignored. Differentiate yourself. If an environment has historically tolerated a specific failure, whether it is a relaxed approach to safety protocols or a casual disregard for deadlines, suddenly enforcing rigid accountability without warning is a breach of trust. A new leader attempting to instantly reverse years of institutional leniency will be met with fierce, justified resistance. The rules must be explicitly reset. One must publicly differentiate their new standard from the historical norm, issuing fair warning and establishing a new baseline of expectation before demanding strict compliance. No nana. When establishing this new, rigorous standard, the delivery must remain untainted by moral superiority. Elevating an expectation while simultaneously expressing contempt for those who previously tolerated a lower standard destroys the fabric of teamwork. True leadership demands the enforcement of high standards without the corrosive indulgence of smugness. The goal is elevation, not alienation. Chapter 2. Master My Stories. How to get your head right before opening your mouth. Hang the gear, heads. The genesis of a catastrophic confrontation rarely begins at the exact moment words are exchanged. The true disaster is invariably engineered in the silent, seething moments before the conversation even starts. Imagine an organization reliant on brilliant technical minds, individuals who can decipher complex code or engineer intricate machinery, yet operate with zero capacity for navigating human friction. When an expectation is violated by one of these technical experts, the immediate internal response of a manager or colleague is often a visceral surge of contempt. We do not merely observe a missed deadline, we internally convict the offender of gross negligence, malicious intent, or profound incompetence. The mental gavel falls long before we have crossed the room to speak to them. We arrive at the threshold of the confrontation not as objective problem solvers but as executioners. Behold, a train wreck. This internal conviction guarantees a disastrous external collision. Consider the chaotic final hours of a massive software release. A critical, system-destroying bug is discovered by the quality assurance team at the 11th hour, threatening to derail months of exhaustive labor. The lead developer, exhausted and running entirely on adrenaline, does not view the testing team as colleagues attempting to save the company from a catastrophic launch. Instead, fueled by a narrative of persecution, the developer views them as deliberate saboteurs, pedantic antagonists intent on ruining his triumph. When the developer storms into the quality assurance department, the ensuing interaction is not a professional diagnostic discussion. It is an emotional bloodbath. Accusations fly, defensive walls are instantly erected, and the underlying technical problem is completely eclipsed by the profound interpersonal damage being inflicted. The hazardous half-minute. The trajectory of this software disaster, and indeed the trajectory of almost every failed interaction, is determined in a minuscule window of time. The 30 seconds immediately following the discovery of a broken promise. In this hazardous half-minute, we process the violation and instantly invent a narrative to explain why it happened. This incredibly brief period is where our emotional equilibrium is either maintained or irreparably shattered. If we fail to manage our internal monologue during these 30 seconds, the resulting confrontation is doomed to fail, regardless of the communication techniques we subsequently attempt to employ. The problem: telling ugly stories. The human mind is a relentless meaning-making machine. We are biologically incapable of merely observing an action without attempting to decipher its underlying motive. When we are disappointed or threatened, the stories we instinctively construct are rarely generous. We spin ugly, villainous tales that cast the other person in the worst possible light. A colleague who interrupts during a meeting is not seen as enthusiastic. They are labeled an egomaniacal credit thief. A spouse who forgets to pay a utility bill is not viewed as overwhelmed. They are branded as fundamentally irresponsible and uncaring. Jumping to conclusions and making assumptions, we bypass the arduous work of gathering evidence and leap directly to damning conclusions. We observe a single, isolated data point, a missing signature, an unreturned phone call, a sarcastic sigh, and extrapolate an entire character profile from it. These assumptions are incredibly dangerous because they are invisible to us. We mistake our subjective, paranoid interpretations for objective, unassailable facts. We genuinely believe we are reacting to reality, when in truth we are reacting to a phantom created entirely by our own insecurities and frustrations. The fundamental attribution error. This destructive tendency is so universal that behavioral scientists have given it a formal designation: the fundamental attribution error. It is a profound cognitive bias wherein we attribute the failures of others entirely to their innate character flaws, while simultaneously attributing our own identical failures to environmental circumstances. If a coworker is late, we decide it is because they are lazy and undisciplined. If we are late, we rationalize it as the unavoidable result of terrible traffic and an overwhelming workload. We grant ourselves the grace of context, yet we relentlessly deny that same context to those who disappoint us. Choosing silence or violence. Armed with a narrative that portrays the other person as a defective, malicious villain, we systematically strip away our own options. When you genuinely believe you are dealing with a monster, rational dialogue appears absurd. Consequently, we force ourselves into a false dichotomy, believing we must choose between two equally destructive paths. Silence. The first path is a coward's retreat. Believing the other person is fundamentally irrational or permanently flawed, we conclude that speaking up is a futile endeavor. We swallow our grievances, retreat into a defensive posture, and allow the infraction to go unchallenged. Yet this silence is never truly quiet. It breeds a toxic, simmering resentment that poisons the environment and guarantees the problem will inevitably repeat. Violence. The alternative to silence is aggressive coercion. Righteous indignation propels us forward to attack, humiliate, or overpower the perceived villain. We employ sarcasm, issue ultimatums, and rely on verbal brutality, convinced that such extreme measures are the only language a flawed person will understand. Violence is costly. The toll exacted by this combative approach is catastrophic. Trust is incinerated, morale collapses, and the psychological safety required for any functional relationship is utterly destroyed. Even if compliance is temporarily achieved through fear, the underlying commitment is lost, replaced by a silent, enduring hostility. You become hypocritical, abusive, and clinically stupid. When the adrenaline of righteous anger floods the brain, our higher cognitive functions are literally hijacked. We lose access to our nuance, our empathy, and our strategic foresight. In this compromised state, we often begin to exhibit the exact same toxic behaviors we are currently condemning in others. We yell at people to demand respect. We act insubordinate while lecturing a subordinate on professionalism. We become blind to our own spectacular hypocrisy. Warning: the most insidious aspect of this anger is its blinding effect. We become so consumed by the perceived sins of the other party that we fail to recognize our own immediate contribution to the crisis. We ignore the reality that our aggressive posturing and abusive tone are actively escalating the tension, making it impossible for the other person to respond rationally. You turn the spotlight on yourself. By unleashing an emotional tirade, we inadvertently grant the offender a tremendous gift. We shift the focus entirely away from their initial mistake. The missing report or the broken promise becomes irrelevant. The central issue is now our inappropriate, unhinged behavior. We provide them with a legitimate grievance to hide behind, transforming them from the instigator into the victim of an abusive boss or an irrational partner. The stories we tell help us justify our worst behavior. Ultimately, these ugly stories serve a deeply selfish psychological purpose. We desperately need the other person to be a villain so that we can feel justified in our choice to use silence or violence. If they are a monster, our cruelty or our cowardice is suddenly morally defensible. We construct a narrative that absolves us of the responsibility to do the hard, mature work of engaging in a respectful, honest confrontation. The solution: tell the rest of the story. The only way to escape this cycle of emotional reactivity is to dismantle the ugly stories before they take root. We must consciously intervene in the hazardous half-minute and force ourselves to expand the narrative. We must abandon the simplistic illusion that people misbehave solely because they are inherently bad, and instead, we must vigorously search for the hidden context. Consider 6 sources of influence. Human behavior is incredibly complex, rarely driven by a single, isolated factor. To truly understand why someone failed to meet an expectation, we must systematically examine the multitude of forces acting upon them. By looking through a wider lens, we can usually identify a perfect storm of circumstances that would cause any reasonable, rational person to act in a similar manner. Cell 1. Self, motivate, pleasure or pain. The first area to examine is intrinsic personal motivation. Does the individual actually find any personal value or satisfaction in completing the required task? Many assignments are inherently tedious, painful, or completely disconnected from a person's core interests. If a task brings only misery, the failure to perform may simply be a profound lack of personal desire, not a malicious plot against you. Cell 2. Self, enable, strength or weakness. Beyond desire, one must assess innate capability. Does the person actually possess the physical strength, the intellectual bandwidth, or the specialized knowledge required to succeed? We frequently demand results from individuals who simply do not possess the skills to deliver. Conflating a lack of ability with a lack of character is a guaranteed path to a disastrous confrontation. Becoming curious. The shift from accusation to exploration requires a fundamental change in posture. We must replace our absolute certainty with genuine curiosity. When faced with a broken promise, the most powerful question we can ask ourselves is not, how do I punish them, but rather, why would a reasonable, rational, and decent human being do this? This single question shatters the illusion of the villain and forces us to investigate reality. Others. We do not operate in a vacuum. Our choices are heavily dictated by the social environment that surrounds us. Cell 3. Others. Motivate, praise or pressure. Social pressure is an immensely powerful force. Are the person's peers actively mocking the desired behavior? Is there a powerful cultural norm within the team that discourages compliance? Often, an individual fails to meet our expectation because fulfilling it would require them to commit social suicide among their closest colleagues. Cell 4. Others enable, help or hindrance. Furthermore, we must ask if other individuals are actively obstructing success. Is a manager withholding critical approval? Is a different department failing to provide necessary raw materials? A perceived failure of personal accountability is frequently a symptom of a massive bottleneck created by someone entirely different. You're a big part of the social formula. Here lies the most uncomfortable truth of any diagnostic process. You must turn the analytical lens squarely upon yourself. In many instances, the person hindering the outcome or crushing the motivation is you. Have your ambiguous instructions, your unpredictable temper, or your micromanagement created an environment where the other person is doomed to fail? Admitting our own complicity is agonizing, but it is entirely necessary. Finally, we must examine the structural and environmental architecture surrounding the individual. The physical world often dictates behavior far more effectively than personal intent. Cell 5. Things motivate, carrot or stick. Are the formal systems of reward and punishment actively working against your goals? Does the company's aggressive bonus structure financially incentivize the exact selfish behavior you are attempting to eliminate? We cannot expect individuals to act contrary to the systems that pay their mortgages. Cell 6. Things enable, bridge, or barrier. Are the physical environments or the organizational structures serving as insurmountable barriers? Gadgets is the required machinery broken? Are the software programs antiquated and constantly crashing? Expecting excellence from employees equipped with failing tools is an exercise in futility. The lack of proper gadgets often transforms a simple task into an impossible ordeal. Data. Does the individual have access to the critical information necessary to perform? Are the feedback loops broken, leaving them completely blind to their own errors? Starved of data, people are forced to guess, and their inevitable mistakes are a failure of the system, not a failure of character. Completing the story. When we diligently force ourselves to examine all these sources of influence, a profound transformation occurs. The two-dimensional villain we created in our mind completely evaporates. In their place stands a complex, ordinary human being struggling against a formidable array of structural barriers, conflicting motivations, and immense social pressures. The paralyzing anger dissipates, replaced by a sense of clarity and a pragmatic desire to solve the actual problem. Use the 6 sources of influence. Systematically mapping an infraction against these 6 sources is the ultimate mental preparation. It ensures that when we finally step into the confrontation, we are addressing the root causes rather than attacking the individual. We move from an adversarial stance to a collaborative posture, entirely focused on dismantling the obstacles that caused the failure. How about our software testing friends? Returning to the enraged developer and the software launch. If he had paused to master his story, the outcome would have been entirely different. By examining the context, he might have realized the testers were forced to work with outdated diagnostic tools, gadgets, were receiving corrupted code from a different department, help or hindrance, and were under extreme executive pressure to find every flaw, praise or pressure. The testers were not his enemies. They were victims of the same broken system. Armed with this complete story, the developer could have approached them as allies to solve the launch crisis, rather than as traitors to be executed. One final comment. Mastering our internal narratives does not mean abandoning accountability or excusing horrific behavior. There are moments when individuals act out of genuine malice or profound negligence. However, assuming the worst possible motive before verifying the facts, guarantees a destructive interaction. Mastering the story ensures that we enter the conversation with a clear, calm mind, prepared to either uncover a systemic failure or, if necessary, confront a genuine behavioral problem with professional, unyielding clarity. Chapter Summary. Master my stories. Before we open our mouths to address a violation, we must master the silent narratives running through our minds. By recognizing our dangerous tendency to invent ugly stories, and by systematically exploring the complex, personal, social, and structural forces that influence behavior, we strip away blinding anger. We replace righteous indignation with intense curiosity, transforming ourselves from emotional assailants into effective, objective problem solvers. Additional resources. For those seeking to master this internal diagnostic process, there are deeper frameworks and self-assessment tools available designed to rigorously test internal assumptions and refine one's ability to accurately diagnose the root causes of complex behavioral failures. What's next? Having successfully identified the correct issue and mastered the chaotic emotional landscape within our own minds, the internal preparation is complete. The crucial moment has arrived. We must now transition from thought to action, stepping into the room to initiate the actual dialogue, a process that demands profound skill to ensure the conversation remains both completely honest and unconditionally safe. Chapter 3. Describe the gap. How to start a crucial confrontation. The transition from solitary mental preparation to vocal execution is the most perilous frontier in any human relationship. We may have successfully mastered our internal narratives and extinguished our righteous anger, but now we must open our mouths and actually speak the words. Far too often, standing at the precipice of a difficult conversation, we suddenly lose our nerve. Instead of confronting the issue with absolute clarity, we rely on a fractured, cowardly strategy of silent transmission. We desperately hope that the other person will somehow sense our disappointment and correct their behavior through some magical, invisible process of osmosis. This silent hope is a delusion. Osmosis is broken. Human beings cannot absorb our unspoken expectations. We must bridge the terrifying silence, and we must do it precisely, identifying exactly what we are confronting. When we finally initiate the dialogue, we are confronting a specific, undeniable void. The gap between what was explicitly expected and what was actually observed. Whether it is a shattered promise, a blatantly missed deadline, or a toxic pattern of bad behavior, the gap is the objective reality of the failure. Yet, before detailing how to articulate this gap, it is crucial to ruthlessly eliminate the disastrous tactics people instinctively employ to avoid directness. Terrified of the impending collision, we play manipulative games. We engage in elaborate, exhausting charades, dropping heavy sighs and subtle passive-aggressive hints, hoping the offender will decode our cryptic signals and fix the problem without us ever having to name it. Worse still, we frequently pass the buck. In a pathetic attempt to preserve our own popularity, we adopt the role of the sympathetic hostage, telling the individual that we personally have no issue with their behavior, but that some invisible corporate policy or an unreasonable upper management figure is forcing us to enforce the rules. This cowardly maneuver destroys our own authority and creates systemic distrust. Or we force the other person to play a grueling game of reading our minds, punishing them with icy withdrawal or sudden hostility until they are forced to guess the nature of their crime. To lead effectively, we must abandon these toxic games and learn from the best communicators who step directly into the gap without hesitation or malice. When the moment arrives to describe the gap, the master communicator does not lead with a hammer, they start with safety. The grand, counterintuitive revelation of human interaction is that individuals do not become defensive because of the specific, difficult words you are speaking. The big surprise is that defensiveness is entirely a reaction to perceived intent. People push back when they believe you are trying to harm them. When psychological safety evaporates, the human brain defaults to its primal neurological programming, fight or flight. You must constantly watch for these physical and conversational signs that safety is at risk. The sudden retreat into silence, or the aggressive escalation into violence. If safety is breached, the conversation is effectively over, regardless of how accurate your facts might be. To maintain this fragile, essential safety, two absolute conditions must be met and fiercely protected: mutual respect and mutual purpose. Respect is the invisible oxygen of any dialogue. The moment it is withdrawn, the other person suffocates and immediately fights for breath, defending their dignity rather than discussing the problem. We maintain this mutual respect by remembering to tell the rest of the story, ensuring we view the person as a complex human navigating multiple influences rather than a two-dimensional villain. However, if despite our best efforts, our words are misinterpreted and respect is damaged, we must restore it instantly. The most potent tool for this restoration is a preemptive technique called contrasting. Contrasting is not an apology, it is a rapid clarification of intent. You explicitly state what you do not intend, immediately followed by what you do intend. By actively dismantling their worst fears, assuring them, for example, that you do not view their recent mistake as a fatal flaw and do not wish to jeopardize their standing, but rather you want to solve a specific workflow issue. You clear the debris of paranoia from the conversational path. Similarly, you must establish an unbreakable sense of mutual purpose. The other person must genuinely believe you are working toward an outcome that benefits both of you, not merely executing a selfish or punitive agenda. You can reinforce this collaborative posture by simply asking for permission to discuss the difficult topic, thereby granting them agency and dignity in the interaction. Furthermore, this critical exchange must always occur in private. Confronting a failure in a public forum, using inappropriate, weaponized humor to mask a critique, or cornering someone in a coordinated group attack instantly shatters safety. These aggressive tactics transform a joint problem-solving session into a public execution, virtually guaranteeing long-term hostility. By combining these safety skills, just as a skilled manager named Wally might seamlessly guide an erratic employee back from the brink of defensive rage by clarifying his supportive intentions, you create an environment where the truth can be spoken without collateral damage. Once the perimeter of safety is secured, you must carefully share your path. The most catastrophic yet common mistake is to keep the other person in the dark about how you arrived at your conclusion, suddenly ambushing them with a harsh verdict. When you lead the conversation with your ugly internal story, hurling accusations of laziness, incompetence, or sabotage, you force the other person into an immediate, violent defense of their character. You must avoid these harsh conclusions at all costs. Instead, you must reverse engineer your cognitive process and start strictly with the facts. Facts are the observable, objective data of the situation. They are devoid of emotion, immune to debate, and provide the least insulting foundation for a difficult conversation. You state the agreed-upon deadline, and you state the time the project was actually delivered. Only after laying out this undeniable data do you tentatively share your story. Tentativeness is the key to maintaining respect. You are not delivering an absolute verdict from on high, but rather offering a hypothesis about what the facts might mean. You use language that leaves room for you to be wrong. As you share this cognitive path, you must continually watch for safety problems, ready to instantly step out of the content and use contrasting if the other person begins to bristle. Crucially, the description of the gap must never end with a period. It must end with a question. By concluding with a genuine diagnostic inquiry, asking for their perspective on what happened, you invite them into the dialogue. You signal that you are open to uncovering the hidden structural or social influences that may have caused the failure, rather than simply acting as an executioner. This deliberate structure provides essential tips for navigating the most agonizingly tough situations. It allows you to avoid the exhausting recurrence of Groundhog Day, where you are doomed to treat a repeated, chronic failure as if it were a first-time offense, endlessly discussing the content while ignoring the pattern. By mastering the art of describing the gap with safety, facts, and tentative curiosity, you transform the terrifying moment of truth. Whether you are confronting a senior executive who is subtly undermining a project or a spouse who is chronically breaking financial agreements, the methodology remains the same. You step out of the silence, secure the perimeter of mutual respect, lay down the unassailable facts, and invite them to solve the problem with you. Chapter 4. Make it motivating: how to help others want to take action. Before we dive into the intricate mechanics of human drive, let us establish a foundational truth about human behavior. Action is rarely the result of spontaneous combustion. It requires a spark, a fuel, and an environment that sustains the flame. When we encounter an individual who consistently fails to meet an expectation, our immediate challenge is not merely to correct a physical action, but to navigate the labyrinth of their internal desires and external pressures. We are attempting to shift the very current of their will. How do we ignite a genuine desire for change without resorting to the blunt instruments of coercion or the fleeting sugar highs of bribery? This phase of the journey dismantles the mythology surrounding motivation, revealing the profound difference between enforcing compliance and inspiring true commitment. It demands that we abandon our instinct for quick fixes and embrace the complex, often agonizing work of making the invisible consequences of their actions vividly, undeniably real. The moment you have successfully established safety and clearly described the gap between what was expected and what actually occurred, the true work begins. You must remember to diagnose the root cause of the failure before attempting any intervention. It is dangerously easy to assume that every broken promise is an act of defiance, a willful refusal born of pure malice. Yet as we stand on the threshold of demanding change, the situation is about to get profoundly complicated. The gap you have observed could be the result of a complete lack of ability, a suffocating organizational barrier, or a genuine deficit of desire. Attempting to motivate someone who is fundamentally unable to perform a task is not just ineffective, it is inherently cruel. Therefore, your first cognitive step must be a silent, rigorous assessment. Is this a matter of skill, or is this a matter of will? When the diagnosis points unequivocally to a lack of will, we must resist the profound temptation to oversimplify motivation. Allow for a small rant regarding how society fundamentally misunderstands human drive. We are obsessed with motivation with a capital M, treating it as an almost mystical innate essence that some people possess in abundance and others lack entirely. We look at a struggling employee or an uncooperative teenager and throw our hands up, lamenting their fundamental lack of ambition. We ask what is wrong with those kids or those workers, assuming their apathy is a permanent character defect. Getting to the root of motivation requires dismantling this fatalistic myth. Motivation is not a genetic trait. It is the calculated, ongoing assessment of consequences. Expectations change everything. An individual's willingness to act is directly tied to what they anticipate will happen if they perform the task, and what they anticipate will happen if they do not. If the perceived pain of completing a difficult assignment outweighs the perceived benefit, the rational human brain will choose inaction. Our task is not to magically instill an ethereal sense of drive, but to fundamentally alter their mathematical calculation of these consequences. In our desperate attempts to alter this calculus, we frequently resort to three deeply flawed approaches that must be avoided at all costs. First, we must not rely on charisma. The belief that sheer force of personality, a rousing speech, or a dynamic cheerleading session can sustain long-term behavioral change is an illusion. Charisma may generate a temporary spike in enthusiasm, but the moment the cheerleader leaves the room, the underlying structural disincentives reassert themselves and the old behaviors return. Second, we must categorically refuse to use power to force compliance. The reason we intuitively rely on force is deeply primal. When we are frustrated, frightened, or facing a missed deadline, our neurological programming urges us to seize control. We want to issue an ultimatum, raise our voice, and wield our authority like a blunt instrument. We must heed the warning. Giving into this impulse means you are about to do something profoundly stupid. The cost of force is staggering and permanent. Force destroys psychological safety and kills relationships. It immediately transforms a collaborative partnership into a hostile standoff. More insidiously, force actively motivates resistance. The harder you push, the more the other person digs their heels in to protect their autonomy and dignity. Consider the corporate manager, dubbed the Hog, who ruled his division through absolute terror and public humiliation. He achieved short-term spikes in productivity, but behind his back, his workforce engaged in a silent, continuous campaign of sabotage, deliberately misplacing orders and ruining machinery to exact their revenge. Force doesn't last. The moment the threat of punishment is removed, the desired behavior completely vanishes. Third, we must be incredibly careful with perks. Just as the stick of punishment yields only superficial compliance, the carrot of artificial rewards creates a toxic dependency. If you constantly bribe children with ice cream to do their chores, or ply employees with extreme bonuses for basic competence, you destroy their intrinsic connection to the value of the work itself. They will quickly learn to demand a higher price for every minor effort. The true solution lies in a completely different paradigm. Instead of imposing external force or offering artificial bribes, we must explore natural consequences. The world is entirely composed of causes and effects. Every action ripples outward, impacting schedules, budgets, safety, and human relationships. The problem is that the person failing to meet the expectation is usually completely insulated from these ripples. Your paramount duty is to make the invisible visible. You must take the hidden, abstract damage caused by their behavior and place it squarely in their line of sight. You accomplish this by linking the requested behavior to their existing values. If an employee values their reputation as an innovator, you must clearly articulate how their chronic lateness is destroying that exact reputation in the eyes of the executive team. You must connect the short-term benefits they currently enjoy, the extra hour of sleep or the avoidance of a difficult task, with the long-term pain that inevitably awaits them, such as career stagnation or the loss of trust. This requires placing an intense focus on long-term benefits. You are not asking them to suffer for your sake. You are asking them to endure a brief, immediate discomfort for a profound, enduring reward. Furthermore, you must introduce the hidden victims of their actions. When a manager fails to process an approval on time, they might view it as a minor administrative oversight. They do not see the downstream assembly worker whose shift is cancelled or the client whose critical delivery is delayed. You must hold up a mirror so they can witness the collateral damage of their apathy. You connect their behavior not to your arbitrary rules, but to the existing carrots and sticks of reality, the natural rewards of competence and the inevitable penalties of failure. Throughout this process, you must meticulously stay in dialogue. You are not delivering a monologue or a lecture. You are engaging in a joint exploration of reality. This requires a profound level of self-awareness to watch for the dangerous line between dialogue and threats. Pointing out a natural consequence, explaining that a repeated failure to file safety reports might lead to a formal disciplinary review, is an act of transparency. However, twisting that consequence into a malicious threat, declaring that if they cross you again, you will personally ensure they are fired, destroys safety and instantly reverts the interaction back to raw force. You must genuinely listen to the other person's view of these natural consequences. They may possess data you lack, or they may value different outcomes entirely. The goal is to stack enough visible, undeniable consequences onto the scales until their internal calculation shifts. You stop exploring when you reach critical mass, the moment you observe a genuine shift in their demeanor, the precise second they recognize that change is not just demanded by you, but fundamentally required by the reality of the situation. This exploration of consequences must dynamically adapt to the specific context. You must match your methods to the circumstances. When you are teaching a new employee or someone stepping into an unfamiliar role, they genuinely may not understand the ripple effects of their actions. Here, your role is largely informational, illuminating the unseen impact of their choices. When you are jointly exploring a complex problem with an experienced colleague, the tone shifts to a collaborative mapping of risks and benefits. However, when priorities differ, when their department's goals actively conflict with yours, the conversation must elevate to finding a superseding mutual purpose that aligns both agendas. And when others actively resist, when they dig in their heels and refuse to acknowledge the damage they are causing, the dialogue becomes an agonizing test of patience and clarity. There are inevitably moments when dialogue reaches its absolute limit, and you must know when to use discipline. Discipline is not a failure of the confrontation model. It is the final, heavy, natural consequence of persistent behavioral failure. When venturing into this severe territory, you must know the mechanics of your organization's formal procedures. You must partner with people in authority, ensuring human resources or upper management are aligned before initiating a formal warning or termination. You must be appropriately somber, stripping away any hint of vindictiveness or anger. This is a tragedy of failed expectations, not a moment of personal triumph. You must explicitly explain the next step, ensuring there is absolute clarity regarding what will happen if the behavior occurs even one more time. Crucially, you must be ruthlessly consistent. Empty threats are the death knell of accountability. Do not back off under pressure, whether that pressure comes from the employee's tears, a union grievance, or your own profound discomfort. If the line is crossed, the consequence must be delivered. Yet there are times when even formal power fails, or when the cost of enforcing discipline would destroy a critical organizational capability. In these rare instances, you must be candid about coping. You sit down and openly admit that the current arrangement is unsustainable, and you agree on a workaround, a structural bypass that insulates the team from the individual's unyielding failure without continuously bleeding emotional energy into useless confrontations. Regardless of whether the conversation ends in a joyous breakthrough, a somber disciplinary warning, or a pragmatic workaround, you must finish well. You summarize the conclusions, reaffirm your respect for the individual, and transition from the agonizing work of diagnosis to the concrete reality of future action. To illustrate the sheer gravity of this process, consider a final, agonizing case. Can a marriage be saved when a spouse fundamentally refuses to engage with their stepchildren? When a husband declares, in actions if not in words, that he hates his wife's children, the emotional devastation is absolute. To confront this through force, demanding he love them under the threat of divorce, will only breed deep, toxic resentment. To bribe him with perks is a grotesque insult to the children. The only viable path is to masterfully explore the natural consequences. The mother must create safety, clearly describe the gap between the chaotic, hostile environment that exists and the sanctuary a home should be. She must hold up the mirror, showing him the hidden victims, the psychological scarring of the children, and the rapid, undeniable erosion of her own love and respect for him. She must connect his short-term desire for isolation to the long-term pain of a fractured, miserable existence. Only when he clearly perceives the immense, catastrophic consequences of his withdrawal can he find the genuine, internal motivation to change. In summary, making it motivating is never about inflicting pain or promising endless rewards. It is the noble, difficult art of illuminating reality. It requires patience, precise dialogue, and the courage to let the natural weight of consequences do the heavy lifting, thereby honoring the agency of the individual while demanding excellence in their behavior. Chapter 5. Make it easy how to make keeping commitments almost painless. We are astonishingly quick to judge the human heart when the true culprit often lies within the limitations of human hands. When a commitment is broken or an expectation is shattered, our immediate, almost reflexive assumption is one of willful defiance. We look at the missed deadline or the incomplete task and instantly conclude that the individual simply did not care enough to follow through. This rush to assign malicious intent is a profound error in judgment. Before we can address any behavioral failure, we must confront the reality that a lack of action does not automatically equate to a lack of desire. Often, the individuals we perceive as stubbornly unmotivated are, in truth, silently paralyzed by obstacles they cannot overcome. The greatest cognitive trap we fall into is the fatal misdiagnosis of the root cause of a problem. We immediately assume a deficit of will, entirely ignoring the possibility of a deficit of skill. This misdiagnosis is disastrous because the remedy for poor motivation, which involves exploring natural consequences and adjusting internal priorities, is completely useless when applied to a problem of ability. You cannot consequence someone into suddenly possessing a skill they lack or overcoming a structural barrier they cannot control. Applying motivational pressure to an ability problem does not generate results. It only generates profound anxiety and deep-seated resentment. The confusion stems from the fact that motivation and ability are inextricably linked, bound together in a complex, shifting equation. When a task is impossibly difficult, when the tools are broken, or when the instructions are maddeningly vague, a person's motivation will naturally plummet. We do not eagerly attack projects that are guaranteed to end in our own failure. Therefore, when we observe someone dragging their feet or avoiding an assignment, we are witnessing a collapse in motivation, but that collapse may be entirely driven by an underlying lack of ability. The two forces are constantly interacting, making it incredibly difficult to isolate the true source of the dysfunction from a distance. Because of this intertwined nature, the signs of both problems look identical. The outward manifestation of a motivation deficit is inaction. The outward manifestation of an ability deficit is identical inaction. This creates an ambiguous cause. When an employee fails to submit a critical report, is it because they despise the assignment, or is it because the software required to pull the data constantly crashes? The silence of the failure offers no clues. In many instances, the situation is even more entangled, presenting a complicated cause where both forces are at play. An individual might be slightly hesitant to perform a task they find tedious, and that minor lack of motivation is then entirely compounded by a cumbersome, poorly designed bureaucratic process, resulting in total paralysis. Most dangerous of all is the masked cause. Human beings are deeply protective of their social standing and professional dignity. It is a profound vulnerability to admit to a superior or a peer that you simply do not know how to do something, or that you are fundamentally incapable of executing a required task. To avoid the crushing embarrassment of looking incompetent, people will deliberately mask their lack of ability behind a facade of bad attitude. They will feign boredom, act insubordinate, or claim the task is beneath them, calculating that it is far more socially acceptable to be viewed as rebellious than to be exposed as inadequate. If you attack the perceived rebellion without investigating the underlying inability, you are fighting a phantom. Recognizing these complex dynamics fundamentally shifts your responsibility in the confrontation. Once you have diagnosed that a barrier exists, your primary job is no longer to be a charismatic cheerleader or a strict enforcer. Your job is to make keeping the commitment easy. You must transform yourself from an architect of consequences into a facilitator of capability. You must become a relentless obstacle remover, clearing the path so that the individual can actually succeed. To accomplish this, you must rely on a specific set of collaborative tools designed for making the execution of the task as painless as possible. The most critical of these tools is the commitment to jointly explore barriers. You cannot sit in your office and guess what is holding the other person back. You must invite them into a diagnostic partnership, asking them to meticulously walk you through the process and identify exactly where the friction occurs. As they begin to describe their struggles, you must fiercely avoid the temptation to offer quick advice. When someone presents a problem, our ego and our desire for efficiency immediately urge us to swoop in as the savior, dispensing instant solutions. This is a critical error. By dictating the solution, you strip the individual of their agency and assume that your perspective is flawless. Furthermore, you must continuously ask yourself if you should simply step in and do the task yourself. While it might be faster in the short term to take the project back, rescuing them completely destroys their long-term development and creates a permanent dependency. You must resist the urge to take the wheel. Instead, you must understand that deep involvement both enables and motivates the individual. When you ask them to help design the solution to their own roadblock, you accomplish two vital objectives simultaneously. First, their intimate knowledge of the daily workflow ensures that the resulting solution actually enables them, addressing the precise, hidden friction points that you as a manager or partner cannot see. Second, the very act of being consulted and granted ownership of the problem-solving process naturally serves to motivate them. They are no longer executing your arbitrary command. They are implementing their own customized strategy. This collaborative process must always start by asking for their ideas. You prompt them to examine the workflow and suggest modifications. You brainstorm ability barriers together, rigorously testing every step of the required action to uncover hidden traps. Does the failure occur because another department is late with raw materials? Is the timeline physically impossible given the current staffing levels? You must dissect the task until the true obstruction is laid bare. As you navigate this exploration, 3 additional hints can guide the dialogue. First, you must advise where necessary, while you should avoid quick, dictatorial advice. You cannot leave them floundering if they genuinely lack the experience to see the solution. When their well of ideas runs completely dry, you must offer guidance, but you do so tentatively, presenting your ideas as options to be evaluated rather than absolute mandates. Second, you must train yourself to think about physical features. We spend so much time analyzing human psychology that we often ignore the concrete world. Sometimes the barrier is not in the mind, it is in the environment. Is the workspace chaotic and distracting? Are the physical tools antiquated and dangerous? Often, the easiest way to change a behavior is to simply alter the physical landscape in which that behavior occurs. Finally, if the individual is paralyzed by fear or embarrassment and refuses to articulate the barriers they are facing, You must prime the pump. You gently offer your own best guess regarding what might be hindering them. By suggesting a plausible, non-threatening obstacle, perhaps asking if the new software update is causing unexpected delays, you demonstrate empathy and show that it is safe to admit to struggling. You offer them a lifeline, a face-saving way to begin discussing their limitations without feeling attacked. By refusing to misdiagnose, by recognizing the tangled relationship between skill and will, and by partnering with the individual to relentlessly identify and dismantle the barriers in their path, you fundamentally alter the nature of the confrontation. You are no longer demanding the impossible. You are systematically engineering an environment where keeping the commitment becomes the most natural, painless, and achievable outcome. Having cleared the path of physical and structural barriers, the true test of your communicative endurance arises when the conversation itself begins to derail, requiring an absolute mastery of focus amidst sudden emotional turbulence. Chapter 6. Stay focused and flexible. What to do when others get sidetracked, scream, or sulk. The architecture of a perfect confrontation can be meticulously designed in the safety of your own mind, but it must ultimately be constructed in the volatile, unpredictable environment of human interaction. You may have flawlessly diagnosed the root cause, cleared away every physical barrier, and stepped into the room with absolute respect and pristine clarity. Yet, the moment you articulate the broken promise, the person sitting across from you might not respond with mature reflection. Instead, they might abruptly burst into tears, hurl a vicious insult, or completely ignore your statement to launch into a bitter tirade about a completely unrelated grievance. Human beings are not static equations. When cornered by their own failures, they frequently deploy chaotic emotional countermeasures. This is the crucible where theoretical preparation shatters against reality, demanding an extraordinary capacity to remain anchored to your original purpose while fluidly adapting to sudden emotional storms. When the dialogue violently derails, you're immediately confronted with a dual mandate. You must not surrender your focus on the original behavioral failure, yet you cannot rigidly bulldoze forward as if the emotional explosion in the room is not happening. This requires a profound tactical maneuver. You must temporarily step out of the original content of the conversation to address the emergent crisis, with the strict intention of returning once the atmosphere is stabilized. There are 4 distinct ways individuals will attempt to derail a crucial confrontation, and each requires a precise, calculated response. The first diversion is the sudden introduction of a completely new, parallel problem. You confront a colleague about a missed deadline, and they instantly counterattack, accusing you of ignoring their emails for the past 3 weeks. The trap here is engaging in a chaotic multi-front war where nothing is resolved. You must acknowledge the new grievance without letting it hijack your original agenda. You pull the new issue out of the tangled web, validate its importance, and explicitly propose dealing with it sequentially, ensuring that the primary failure is fully addressed before shifting focus. The second and most intimidating derailment is an eruption of pure, aggressive hostility. When the other person begins to scream, our biological instinct screams back, urging us to either match their violence or flee the room. True flexibility demands overriding this primal urge. An explosion of anger is almost never about the facts of the situation. It is a desperate, overwhelming signal that psychological safety has been completely destroyed. The individual feels profoundly threatened. You must entirely abandon the topic of the broken promise and pour all of your energy into rebuilding mutual respect and clarifying your benign intent until the adrenaline subsides and rational thought can return. Conversely, the third emergent problem is the sudden retreat into sulking, tears, or victimhood. This can be a genuine manifestation of deep distress or a calculated, manipulative shield designed to make you feel like an abusive monster for simply asking for accountability. Regardless of the intent, treating tears with cold, robotic logic is catastrophic. You must soften your approach, validate the emotional weight they are experiencing, and gently explore the narrative they have constructed that is causing such profound pain, moving them out of their emotional paralysis and back into collaborative dialogue. The final, and often most maddening diversion, is absolute silence. The individual simply refuses to engage, staring blankly or offering monosyllabic responses. This stonewalling is a heavy armor forged from fear or profound apathy. To break this silence, you must not resort to interrogation. Instead, you gently attempt to prime the pump of conversation, offering your own best guesses about what might be causing their hesitation, thereby creating a safe, non-threatening bridge for them to finally cross and articulate their hidden concerns. Throughout all of these turbulent diversions, the most powerful stabilizing mechanism at your disposal is the discipline of reflecting their chaotic energy back to them as ordered clarity. When the other party spirals into complex emotionally charged justifications or throws up a frantic smokescreen of excuses, you listen with radical intensity. Then, you carefully restate their core emotional grievance in your own words, stripping away the vitriol and distilling it to its essence. This is not an act of capitulation. You are not agreeing that their anger is justified or their excuses are valid. You are simply proving, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that their words have actually landed. When a defensive human being realizes they are genuinely being heard and accurately understood, the desperate, frantic need to yell or shut down frequently evaporates. You extinguish the emotional fire by removing the oxygen of misunderstanding. To successfully navigate the treacherous waters of human defensiveness, one must cultivate a mindset that is simultaneously unyielding and infinitely adaptable. You remain rigidly focused on the ultimate necessity of addressing the broken promise, but you remain entirely flexible regarding the path required to get there. When the other person introduces new grievances, erupts in sudden fury, or withdraws into a fortress of silence, you do not panic and you do not surrender. You temporarily suspend your agenda, step into their emotional reality, rebuild the shattered safety of the interaction, and use profound listening to disarm their defenses. Only by resolving the emergent emotional crisis can you clear the air sufficiently to return to the true north of the conversation. With the sudden storms weathered, the emotional diversions expertly handled, and a state of mutual understanding firmly re-established, the intensely psychological and diagnostic phase of the confrontation draws to a close. The abstract analysis of motivations, abilities, and emotional safety is complete. The energy of the interaction must now undergo a fundamental shift, moving away from understanding the past and toward dictating the concrete, undeniable reality of the future. Chapter 7. Agree on a plan and follow up. How to gain commitment and move to action. The resolution of a conflict is often a dangerous illusion. We experience a profound surge of relief when the difficult words have finally been spoken, when the emotional storm has passed, and when a shared understanding appears to have been reached. We shake hands, we smile, and we retreat, desperately wanting to believe the crisis has been permanently averted. Yet this comforting sense of closure is frequently the most perilous moment in human interaction. We mistake the alignment of minds for the guarantee of future action. It requires immense vulnerability to expose our grievances and dismantle our defensive walls, but it is a catastrophic failure of leadership to assume that a successful dialogue automatically translates into a repaired reality. The words spoken in the safety of a closed room mean absolutely nothing if they are not bound to the unforgiving architecture of a concrete plan. Even the most harmonious resolutions are haunted by predictable problems. We possess a deeply flawed ability to forecast the future, an optimistic blindness akin to gazing into a fractured crystal ball. We assume that because an individual nodded in sincere agreement today, they will flawlessly execute the required new behavior tomorrow. This assumption is a devastating trap. Attempting to build long-term accountability on the foundation of vague promises is a futile exercise, a maddening endeavor that feels identical to the impossible task of nailing gelatin to a wall. Without precise, rigid boundaries, human commitment inevitably loses its shape and dissolves under the pressure of daily routine. When an employee enthusiastically agrees to try harder or a partner promises to be more considerate, we often accept these formless pledges as victory. In truth, these are not commitments. They are comforting noises, linguistic escape hatches designed to alleviate the immediate discomfort of the confrontation. When we accept these ambiguous promises, we guarantee our own future misery, effectively ensuring that we will be having the exact same agonizing conversation weeks or months down the line. The absolute antidote to this formless good intention is the ruthless application of specificity. Every successful confrontation must culminate in the forging of an unbreakable contract of action, a plan built upon 4 uncompromising pillars. Who is going to do exactly what, by when, and how will we follow up? If a single pillar is missing, the entire structure of accountability collapses. The assignment of responsibility must be singular and absolute. A task assigned to a group is a task assigned to no one, as human nature instinctively waits for someone else to step forward and shoulder the burden. The definition of the required action must be razor-sharp, leaving zero room for subjective interpretation. In defining this action, we must once again employ the tool of contrasting, explicitly stating what an acceptable outcome does not look like, thereby preemptively closing the loopholes that inevitably tempt those seeking the path of least resistance. Furthermore, a commitment without a strict deadline is merely a pleasant hallucination. The dimension of time transforms a vague, floating aspiration into an undeniable, concrete obligation. Yet even a perfectly defined assignment paired with a precise deadline is highly vulnerable to the chaos of human existence and shifting priorities. This necessitates the final, vital pillar, the architecture of follow-up. We must establish a clear, unyielding rhythm of verification, utilizing two distinct methods. The checkup is an active, scheduled intervention where we deliberately pause to measure progress against the agreement, ensuring the trajectory remains true and intervening before small deviations become massive failures. The checkback, conversely, places the burden of reporting entirely on the shoulders of the individual, requiring them to proactively confirm completion. Choosing the appropriate method requires a delicate, highly situational assessment of the individual's history, competence, and reliability. We must carefully balance the need for rigorous oversight with the profound psychological necessity of granting autonomy. As the architecture of this plan is finalized, we must vehemently resist the urge to rush toward the exit. The cognitive load of a difficult dialogue is immense, and critical details are easily lost in the fading adrenaline. We must deliberately take the time to comprehensively summarize the newly forged agreement, demanding that the other party articulate the plan in their own words. This is the ultimate undeniable test of clarity. If they cannot accurately recite the terms, the agreement does not truly exist. Finally, as we prepare to close the interaction, we must acknowledge the silent, lingering anxiety that often haunts the end of these demanding encounters. People worry deeply about their professional standing, their competence, and the enduring strength of the relationship after a conflict. It is an act of profound grace and emotional intelligence to conclude not merely with cold, logistical mandates, but with an authentic reaffirmation of mutual respect. By transforming chaotic emotion into structured, undeniable action, and by walking away with absolute clarity regarding who will do what and by when, we definitively seal the breach. The confrontation ceases to be a source of trauma and becomes the very engine of progress, moving us decisively from the chaotic realm of fractured expectations into the solid, unyielding terrain of transformed reality. Chapter 8. Put it all together. How to solve big, sticky, complicated problems. The journey through the architecture of human conflict brings us to a profound realization. Understanding the isolated mechanics of communication is entirely different from orchestrating them in the chaotic theater of real life. We have dissected the anatomy of a crucial confrontation into distinct, manageable disciplines. Yet, when we face a genuinely terrifying, complex crisis, when the stakes are monumental and the emotions are blinding, these skills must not remain isolated theories. They must be synthesized into a seamless, fluid motion. To truly master this art, one must learn how to put it all together to solve the big, sticky, complicated problems that threaten our most vital institutions and relationships. Before diving into the deepest waters, we must anchor ourselves to the big idea from each preceding step. The foundation is the terrifying, essential choice of what and if to confront. We must unbundle the chaos, distilling the mess into a single crystalline sentence, addressing the pattern or the relationship rather than just the immediate content. Having chosen our target, we must instantly turn inward to master our stories. We recognize our dangerous biological reflex to invent villainous narratives, and we deliberately force ourselves to explore the 6 sources of influence, replacing our blinding anger with intense curiosity. When we finally open our mouths, we do not launch an attack. We describe the gap. We secure the fragile perimeter of psychological safety by establishing mutual purpose and utilizing contrasting to assure respect. We share our path, starting with undeniable facts and tentatively offering our interpretation. Once the issue is on the table, we face the arduous task of making it motivating and making it easy. We abandon the toxic tools of force and charisma, choosing instead to illuminate the natural, invisible consequences of the behavior, while simultaneously partnering with the individual to relentlessly clear away the physical and structural barriers that paralyze their ability. And as we navigate this delicate exchange, we stay fiercely focused and flexible. We weather the emotional storms, the sudden tears, and the aggressive counterattacks, temporarily stepping out of the content to restore safety before returning to the true north of the dialogue. Finally, we refuse to accept the illusion of a vague resolution. We agree on a plan and follow up, forging an unbreakable contract of who will do what, by when, and how we will measure success. To observe this synthesized mastery in action, consider a maddening, complex scenario that constantly plagues human interaction. The agonizing dilemma of deciding whether a systemic failure is rooted in your own leadership or in the unyielding stubbornness of another. Imagine a dynamic where a highly capable employee is suddenly micromanaged by a newly appointed director. The director constantly bypasses the employee, issuing direct orders to their subordinates, rewriting their reports, and hovering over every decision. The employee is suffocating, their morale is collapsing, and they are on the verge of resigning. The mess is tangled, deeply emotional, and fraught with the perilous power dynamic of confronting a superior. The employee must begin by choosing what and if to confront. Should they confront the gap? Absolutely. The cost of silence is the destruction of their career and the loss of their dignity. But what do they really want? They do not want to start a war, and they do not want to be fired. They want the autonomy they earned, and they want a functional, trusting relationship with the director. The core issue is not the rewritten report. It is the pattern of usurpation and the fundamental lack of trust. Before scheduling the meeting, the employee must ruthlessly master their stories. The immediate ugly narrative is that the director is an egomaniacal tyrant intent on destroying the employee's authority. But the employee forces themselves to tell the rest of the story. Could it be that the director, being new, is terrified of failure and fundamentally misunderstands the employee's competence? Could upper management be placing unbearable pressure on the director for immediate results? By expanding the lens, the employee steps away from a narrative of malice and embraces a narrative of misaligned expectations. Stepping into the director's office, the employee's first words must make it safe. They establish mutual purpose and use contrasting instantly, clarifying that they are deeply committed to ensuring the division hits the new targets, and that they absolutely do not want to challenge the director's authority. However, they express a vital need to discuss how the workflow is coordinated, framing the current process as a mutual obstacle rather than a personal attack. With safety established, the employee moves to describe the gap, relying entirely on facts. They outline the specific dates when reports were submitted directly to the executive committee without final review, and when the team was given new deadlines without the employee's knowledge. They explain that when these decisions bypass their desk, they are left completely blind and the team becomes confused about the chain of command. As the director becomes defensive, the employee must make it motivating and make it easy, exploring the 6 sources of influence. The employee does not threaten, they illuminate natural consequences. They explain that being removed from the loop prevents them from shielding the director from operational errors, and that the team's productivity is actively dropping due to conflicting instructions. The employee then explores ability, asking if there is a specific metric or type of data they are failing to provide, and how they can ensure the director has the absolute confidence needed to delegate the tasks back to them. If the director suddenly pivots, attacking the employee's past performance on a completely different project, the employee must stay focused and flexible. They do not meander. They choose to address the immediate emotional flare-up without surrendering their agenda. They paraphrase for understanding, validating the director's deep disappointment over a past failure and acknowledging how it damaged trust. Once the director feels heard and the tension subsides, the employee firmly but gently guides them back, asking to establish a clear protocol for handling daily tasks moving forward before addressing the historical failure. As the dialogue reaches a breakthrough, the employee refuses to leave the room with a vague promise to communicate better. They agree on a plan and follow up, They decide who does what by when, establishing that all strategic directives will be sent to the employee by Monday mornings, and in return, the employee will provide a daily end-of-day brief. They solidify the contract by scheduling a check-up meeting for 2 weeks later to measure their progress. This is the architecture of profound change. Yet, as we survey this rigorous discipline, a final haunting comment often arises. Can people really do this? It is an important aside to acknowledge the sheer terrifying weight of this methodology. In the heat of the moment, under the crushing pressure of adrenaline and fear, accessing this level of grace and precision feels almost superhuman. It is undeniably difficult. We are biologically wired to fight or flee, not to pause, diagnose, and construct elegant bridges of mutual purpose. However, breaking from the pack requires enduring the discomfort of this unnatural discipline. The vast majority of the human race will spend their entire lives locked in the misery of silent resentment or destructive violence. They will accept fractured families, toxic workplaces, and squandered potential as the unavoidable tragedies of existence. But the individuals who shape the world, the leaders who truly transform organizations, the partners who forge unbreakable marriages, the human beings who leave a legacy of profound trust, are those who refuse to be governed by their primal instincts. They recognize that the mastery of crucial confrontations is not a magical gift. It is a forged skill. By deliberately slowing down, by demanding absolute honesty paired with absolute respect, and by committing to the relentless pursuit of truth over comfort, ordinary people can absolutely achieve extraordinary results. So Chapter 9. The 12 Yeah-buts. How to deal with the truly tough. We often reach the end of a transformative intellectual journey and find ourselves nodding in quiet agreement at the elegant logic of the framework presented. The principles of resolving conflict, diagnosing ability versus motivation, and establishing clear, unyielding plans seem unassailable in theory. Yet, almost instantly, a quiet, persistent voice of doubt rises from the depths of our experience. We think of the specific individuals in our lives who seem entirely immune to structured dialogue. We recall the bizarre, edge-case scenarios that defy neat categorization. Human nature is uniquely equipped with a defensive mechanism designed to protect us from the arduous work of change, the exception. We construct elaborate arguments about why these refined communication skills will work for everyone else, but will surely fail in our unique chaotic environment. This final exploration is a deliberate confrontation of that exact resistance. It is an acknowledgement that reality is rarely as clean as a theoretical model, and an uncompromising guide to navigating the truly tough scenarios that threaten to plunge us back into the destructive habits of silence and aggression. Borderline behavior. Imagine a colleague or a subordinate who never overtly breaks a documented rule but consistently operates in a maddening gray area of acceptable conduct. They deliver the project on time, but they do so with a heavy sigh, a subtle eye roll, and an aura of malicious compliance. They deploy biting sarcasm masked as humor, leaving you entirely unsure if you have been insulted or simply included in a joke. This is borderline behavior, and it is uniquely paralyzing because it defies easy categorization. If you attempt to confront the single, isolated sigh or the ambiguous joke, you immediately appear petty and paranoid. The offender will instantly retreat behind a wall of plausible deniability, accusing you of micromanagement and hypersensitivity. The individual incident is mathematically too small to formally discipline, yet the cumulative, corrosive effect of this behavior is a toxic erosion of team morale and psychological safety. The solution to this maddening dynamic requires a disciplined elevation of perspective. You must completely abandon the futile exercise of chasing the individual ghosts of bad behavior. Instead, you must confront the solid, undeniable pattern. The conversation must shift away from the specific eye roll and center entirely on the overarching atmosphere of disrespect and the erosion of collaborative energy. By refusing to debate the minutiae and instead defining the broader boundary of acceptable workplace culture, you drag the borderline behavior out of the shadows and into the blinding light of mutual accountability. Our plate is overflowing. The most insidious and universally accepted lie we tell ourselves is that we simply lack the time to address behavioral failures. We stare at towering piles of operational emergencies, impending deadlines, and unrelenting quotas, and we convince ourselves that an hour spent exploring a broken promise is an hour stolen from real, productive work. We adopt the martyr's narrative, believing we are simply too vital to the immediate survival of the organization to pause and engage in interpersonal maintenance. This is a profound and catastrophic miscalculation of temporal economics. When we ignore a crucial conflict under the guise of being too busy, we do not actually save time. We merely borrow it at an exorbitant, ruinous interest rate. The unaddressed failure will inevitably replicate. A subordinate's chronic inability to format a report properly means you will spend 30 hidden minutes every week correcting their work. A toxic dynamic between two departments means every joint project will be bogged down by endless email chains and political maneuvering. True efficiency is never found in the chaotic evasion of conflict. The paradox of time management is that avoiding a difficult conversation requires infinitely more energy than having it. We must shatter the illusion that confronting bad behavior is an interruption of our work. It is, in fact, the very core of our work. The courage to pause the machinery, address the friction at its source, and permanently eliminate the drag on the system is the only path to genuine, sustainable velocity. I don't think we can change. The final, crushing barrier to personal and organizational transformation is the profound gravity of history. When an environment has been defined by years or even decades of broken trust, punitive management, and entrenched cynicism, the prospect of suddenly implementing a new paradigm of respectful accountability feels hopelessly naive. The weight of past failures creates a suffocating atmosphere of despair. People will listen to these new concepts, nod politely in the meeting, and then silently retreat to their established defensive trenches, absolutely convinced that the culture is permanently calcified and that human beings are incapable of fundamental change. Overcoming this deep-seated institutional despair requires an unwavering commitment to the incremental accumulation of proof. Trust is never resurrected by a single, flawless confrontation, nor is a toxic culture cured by an elegant manifesto. Belief in the possibility of change is rebuilt through a relentless, exhausting sequence of small, consistent victories. Every time a promise is publicly honored, a microscopic fracture appears in the armor of cynicism. Every time an emotional explosion is met with calm, diagnostic exploration rather than retaliatory fire, the old expectations begin to crumble. We must accept that early attempts at these crucial dialogues will be messy, awkward, and met with fierce skepticism. The transformation is not an event. It is a war of attrition against the established habits of silence and violence. By refusing to surrender to the myth of fixed traits, and by persistently applying the tools of respect and accountability, the impossible gradually becomes the standard, and the deeply entrenched resistance finally yields to the profound relief of functional, honest human connection.